how come God is the crazy option? To understand everything around us by science, the more God is coming to the forefront. Why, Vince Vitale writes this chapter, brilliant chapter, but why is God the crazy option? Any altar that we make, friends, can I tell you, there will be no answer. There will be no fire. Father, we repeat the words of that song this morning and we say that, Lord, we just want you to open the eyes of our heart. We want to see more of Jesus. And Lord, we are reliant on you for that. So open our hearts, speak to our hearts, we ask, as your word is brought in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, if you'd like to meet me in 1 Kings chapter 18, I've entitled this morning's message, Return to Mount Carmel. I was going to call it God's Troublemakers, but if you put that on Facebook, you deserve the feedback you'll get from that one. So we all know about Elijah, and we all know roughly what happened with Elijah and the events of his life, but he is well known for what happened at Mount Carmel. He is well known for the showdown, in a sense, that happened at Mount Carmel. But there's so much more going on here than just a showdown between gods. This is more than God flexing his muscles, and this is more than antagonising the false gods. But I read a book recently by Ravi Zacharias, co-authored with Vince Vitale. It's called Jesus Amongst Secular Gods, and I've put it into our church library. So if you want to read it, let me know. You can have it any time you like. It's pretty easy to understand because I could understand it, so it must be reasonably easy to understand. It's got my highlights in it, but you can read it any time you like. But he addresses the fact, in the first chapter he says that there is a push that is becoming more and more prevalent for people to build altars where they can worship against God. And he calls these altars the isms of today. I'm going to go through some of those briefly because there is actually two things happening at Mount Carmel in 1 Kings chapter 18. There's two things happening there. First and foremost, absolutely, Elijah is challenging the false gods of his time. But we so often forget who it is that Elijah is addressing. It's Israel. It's the people of God. And we'll have a look at how that unfolds. But let's have a look at some of the isms of today and let's see if we can sort of identify some of them. The first one that Ravi Zacharias deals with is relativism. And relativism, I love Greg Koukl because he writes a book surrounding this and postmodernism. And he says that relativism is really just our feet planted in midair. And then he entitled a book, Feet Planted Firmly in Midair. Relativism has no foundation. It has nothing that you can build on. It actually sounds illogical because relativism basically is what's true for you is not for me. And we have a society that is quickly erecting walls because God is pressing in on their walls. God is becoming more prevalent on people, so we have to build fortresses and we have to build an altar where we can worship. And now you can't impose truth on me because what is true for you is not true for me. We've removed objectivism to subjectivism. And they're just fancy words, which means you can't impose truth on me anymore. I'll call truth what I want to call truth. I'll call morals what I want to call morals. They did that in 1939 and look how that turned out. When they put the leaders of the Nazi regime on trial at Nuremberg, they found they had a problem. In Germany, not one of them had committed a crime. So we have to appeal to an objective morality. And so they did. So we have the United Nations. But relativism is it's true for you, but it's not for me. The next one is scientism, where people will claim we have disproved God by science. You are a long way from disproving God by any scientific method. In fact, the more science we are coming, how come God is the crazy option? When we're sitting on a rock that's spinning at 68,000 miles an hour and has done for thousands of years without a problem, how did that happen by chance? Why is God the crazy option? And the more the people realise this, the more we realise, well, you know what? We're going to have to come up with some other sort of realistic answers here. So we come to pluralism. There's another ism that Ravi Zacharias comes up with, and this is simply there's many paths to the one God. Jesus made it clear in John 14, chapter 6, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. There are not many ways to the one God. There is one way, Jesus said, and it is through him. Here's another one, atheism. Atheism will claim we don't have any faith. Wrong. You need more faith to hold to atheism than you do to any form of religion in the world currently today. What atheism basically says, let's lift the lid on it. Basically, atheism says there is no God, so everything that happened around us is all by chance and it came out of nothing. When was the last time anybody observed something coming into existence out of nothing? When was the last time anybody was sitting in their lounge room and an elephant popped onto your couch? It does not happen. Nobody has ever known it to happen. But atheism will declare that's the only way that it could have happened. Humanism says we don't need God. And there are many today that will say we're just fine without him, thanks. We can cure ourselves. We can fix ourselves. We can build our own cities without realising that you're not even breathing your own oxygen. And the last one, which I didn't have a slide for, is hedonism. And people have erected altars of hedonism that says whatever makes you happy. And that is a very dangerous altar for anybody to worship at. I believe it was it Mark Twain that worshipped at that idol and could never find any happiness at all. So we must live lives just like Elijah did. You know, Elijah was called God's troublemaker. And he lived at a time when King Ahab was one of the most wicked kings that Israel had ever seen. We'll touch on this next Sunday night, but the history of Israel is the history of one thing, revival. Every time they would drift away from God, and then they would come back, and they would drift away from God. But no further had they drifted away from God than under the leadership of Ahab. You know, chapter 19, I think it is, and verses 30 and 33 tell us that Ahab did wicked things in the sight of the Lord, that there was none before him that was so wicked. And he will call Elijah the troublemaker. And in I think it's chapter 21, he will go on to say to Elijah, you are my enemy. Why? Because Elijah stood up against Ahab and all his wickedness. There was another Elijah that would come in the New Testament time, right about the time of Jesus, and they said John the Baptist is like Elijah, and he had his head cut off for standing up for what marriage really looked like. You should not be married to your brother's wife. So Elijah is called God's troublemaker. Why? Because he stood up against all the altars of his day. And we should be God's troublemakers, not looking for trouble, but we should have a world that's going, we're sick and tired of hearing from you guys. Good. Every time we want to do something, you Christians stand up. Please, may we continue to take a stand for him. But this is going to come home to us in a moment. You know, Elijah's going to certainly call the prophets of Baal and Asherah in a moment. He's going to call them out in a moment, and God is absolutely going to flex his muscles. But there's a reason for it. Let's keep reading on. Verse 17 says, when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, is it you, you troubler of Israel? And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, you have, and your father's house. Because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord. Who abandoned who? And followed the Baals. Now therefore send and gather all of Israel to meet me at Mount Carmel. And also the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and he said, how long will you go limping between two different opinions? How long? And we must ask ourselves the same question, because Elijah is challenging the opinions of Israel. And we'll have a look at what he means by how long will you sway between two opinions, or how long will you dance. But how long? How many sermons are we going to need before we cross that line for God? How many Sundays are we going to need before we go, you know what, that's it, Lord, you can have all of my heart? You see, we act a lot like Thomas. We think we can hold our hearts ransom. You know, Thomas did exactly the same thing. They said, Jesus is risen. And he said, I'm not going to believe that. Because he knew that believing that meant he had to cross a line that he could not go back over. If Jesus is risen from the dead, then that means all of my life, and that means all of my heart. And unless I see the holes in his hands, and unless I put my fingers in his holes, unless I place my hand in his side, I will not believe. Can you hear the list of demands that Thomas has? Unless I see the holes in his hands. And if you think that we're any different, we're not. We all have our same lists. God, if you will only do this, or if you will only make me like that, or if you will only fix all of my mess. How long will we hold on to our hearts like we can ransom our hearts? We can't. Jesus has paid the ransom for our hearts. He's already paid all he can pay. But he says, how long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, then follow him. And this going limping between two different opinions is like, one commentator puts it like, Israel is like the unfaithful marriage partner. They want all the benefits of the marriage covenant and their partner, but they want that illicit dancing partner over here as well. You have a look at the history of Israel in the Old Testament, and you will see that they so often danced between two different opinions. And Paul says that what has been written in the Old Testament was written for our instruction. These are parables written to us, friends. This is God saying, you know what you see here in the physical is so often what happens in our hearts. We dance between two opinions. We want to have our foot all the way in heaven, but we just want to keep our toes dipped in the waters of the world. And I believe God would call every one of us to Mount Carmel to make a decision, because that's what Elijah is doing to the people of God. He says, right here, right now, this is where you worship. You worship the Baals, you worship the Asherahs. You know, we're going to set it straight. You need to make a decision today. But so often, we dance between two opinions. Elijah goes on and says, if the Lord is God, then follow him. How many Sundays do we need? How many more programs do churches have to formulate? How many times do we have to come up with the greatest new fad? How many more lights and smoke and mirrors and everything do we have to put on stage before we realise that's not what it's all about? How long will we read the scriptures and close the book and go away and forget? One of the most powerful books I've ever read is by a man by the name of A.W. Tozer. A.W. Tozer was a man that was born again by a street preacher. And he was 19 years of age when he gave his heart to God. Never went to seminary, but one of the greatest pastors I've ever read. He didn't write too many books, but he read a profound one called The Pursuit of God. And there was one sentence in that book that absolutely smashed me, and it was, he waits to be wanted. The desire of God's heart is he waits to be wanted. He waits for us to make that choice. How long will we dance with all the other partners in the room before we make the decision, I only want to dance with you, God? He waits to be wanted. What Elijah is doing right now is he's challenging the idols in their hearts. And very easily, so often, we pass off idolatry as something that was in the Old Testament and Bible times. And we so often think of idolatry as just these little wooden things, perhaps, or these poles that they set up, or these altars that they set up. But you know what? Idolatry is worshipping anything apart from God. That's what idolatry looks like. And you know, we read in Bible times of some names of some idols like Baal and Asherah. Can I give you some more names? Money, career, relationships, things, theology. I know a lot of people that hide behind theology. Do you know you can find God in these pages, but you can lose God in these pages? How long will we hang on to the idols that are in our hearts? You see, every single person, some of them don't even know it, but every person was designed to worship, and every person will worship. And that may look like you'll worship your career, or that may look like you'll worship, you must have your house full of stuff, or you must have the next best car, or you must have the next best house. Friends, believe me, having all of those things, God has given us everything in this earth to enjoy. I mean, we have to challenge ourselves. I mean, I even challenge myself at times. Am I as zealous for the things of God and the things in these pages as I am when I go fishing? There are people that won't fish with me in Tasmania because they say it's like an army mission. It's like we leave no holds barred when we go fishing. But are we like that when we come to the things of God? And are we as passionate about the things of God as we are to tread the fairways of the golf courses? What is it that has our heart? Doing these things has no problem at all. It's whether these things possess us. Who is it that possesses our hearts? We read in Jeremiah's time that the temple was empty of God. Why? Friends, Jeremiah says, I know what goes on behind the curtain. You come out here and you put on your show. And that's what was happening in the temple. They would come out before all the people and put on this wonderful show. They would slaughter animals on the steps of the temple, and then they would go and pull the curtain back, close the curtain, and they'd have all their idols laid out there. And then you wonder why God's not in the house. He doesn't share, friends. He doesn't share. I remember watching a movie called Lone Survivor. I think I've touched on this before. And it's a true story of 4 Navy SEALs that are sent off in Afghanistan to knock off a guy that's pretty heinous. But it all goes pear-shaped because as they're approaching, they realise they have no communications. The side of the mountain they're on means they can't communicate with base, but they've been given a mission. But they strike a problem where they come across some goat herders. And they discuss it amongst themselves. They make the right decision, by the way, because there was 3 of them that said, no, let's just deal with this problem here. But they made the right decision in the end, and they let these guys go because they reasoned that by the time they could make the village and alert anybody, they could make the summit that they could see. We can make the summit, we can make communications, and we can get ourselves out of here. Problem was, they had everything calculated down quite correctly, but the problem was when they got to that summit, it was only a ridgeline. It was a false summit. It's what mountaineers call false summits. And there are people today chasing false summits. They are chasing things that they think will give them all the satisfaction in life, that will bring them all the completeness that they've ever wanted and satisfy all their longings. But when they get to the top of that ridgeline, they realise there's nothing here. Let's have a look at what happened with these guys. Follow me down to verse 26, please. What happens here, just paraphrasing and bringing us up to speed here, what happens is, Elijah says, you build your altar and you choose your own bull. You do everything you want to do, but you're not allowed to strike a match to the altar. And he says, and then I'll take whatever's left over. And he does something interesting with his altar, and we'll have a look at it in a moment. But verse 26, and they took the bull that was given them and they prepared it, and they called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice and nobody answered. And so it is for the people today that are clambering for these false summits. They get to the top and realise, you know what, nobody else is actually here. I was seeking all the satisfaction in this relationship, but it turns out there's nothing here. And I was hoping that my career would give me all the answers to life, but it turns out there's nothing here. And I was hoping that I could have all the morality that I wanted for myself, but it turns out there's really nothing here anymore. Just like these guys. And they limped around the altar that they had made. Any altar that we make, friends, can I tell you, there will be no answer. There will be no fire. But let's have a look at what Elijah does. Come with me to verse 30. Elijah mocks them, and we won't go through the mocking. And it ends in verse 29 with, there was no voice and no one answered and no one paid attention to all. Isn't it funny how they cut themselves, these guys? They dance around the altar, they cut themselves, and it doesn't matter what they do, nobody answers. Verse 30. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." And all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. He doesn't build a new altar. He builds the one that was supposed to be there in the first place. Worship for Israel was supposed to look like this, and Elijah doesn't even presume to think that he'll make it up as he goes along. I'm not going to make any altar here. I'm not going to fashion anything here. I'm going to rebuild the one that we should have been worshipping at from all the time. He repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench about the altar as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. Let's have a look at what happens here. Verse 33. And he put the wood in order, and he cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill your jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. And the water around the altar filled the trench, and they filled the trench also with water. Isn't it interesting how what actually ends up happening here is that fire will come down from heaven and consume. And do you know, friends, that when we are worshipping God at the altar that we were supposed to, there is nothing physical on this earth that will stop the fire of God coming down on your life. Greatest advice C.H. Spurgeon ever gave a up-and-coming pastor. He was about to, because C.H. Spurgeon had a pastor's seminary, he's about to leave the seminary. He says, "What advice can you give me? What one piece of advice can you give me?" And C.H. Spurgeon says, he says, "Son," he says, "you set yourself on fire," he says, "and the world will come and watch you burn." What Elijah is saying is we are called not to be thermometers, we are called to be thermostats. We are not called to walk out of these walls here. We're not called to go to work tomorrow. We're not called to go to our schools tomorrow and just reflect the temperature that the world wants us to reflect. Rather, we are supposed to go to our workplaces and set the temperature. And we see in the history of Israel, that's exactly what happens with leadership. The health and vitality, spiritually speaking, for Israel was reflected upon its leadership. Huge challenge. This is what keeps pastors up at night. This is what should keep elders and board members up at night, because we set the temperature. And then we, as a group, set a temperature outside of these walls. Fathers, you're supposed to be setting a temperature inside your house. A temperature that looks like this. The end of the story is, of course, that the prophets of Baal and Asherah, God flexes his muscles, and when God flexes his muscles, there's nothing left behind. We understand that Israel is given an absolute choice here, but do you know we still see the swaying in Israel? We still see the swaying. We still see the dancing hearts. And what's God got to do? It's a question maybe we need to ask ourselves. What has God got to do that we will stop the dancing? What does God have to do? The end of the story is that, of course, they'd been in a drought for some time. They'd been in a drought for something like 3.5 years. And God says, "Now go to Ahab and I will send rain." And, rain comes after Elijah prays fervently. He prays fervently and there is a drought. He prays fervently, the drought ends and the rain comes. But the hand of the Lord was on Elijah. That's what makes the difference. In fact, the hand of the Lord was upon Elijah, and he runs and overtakes Ahab, who's in a chariot, and beats him to the next city. It's amazing what happens when the hand of God is on us. Elijah came to challenge the idols physically that Israel were worshipping. But Jesus came to take it another step further. When Jesus came, he wanted to challenge the idols that were in our hearts. You see, worship starts on the inside, and everything that happens on the outside is a result of what's on the inside. Everything that we do worship-wise is from a heart that wants him first and foremost. Hebrews chapter 1 says that God in previous times had spoken to us by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. And what is the loud and clear message that God is speaking to us through Jesus? I want you. He wants all of us. As I ask the worship team if they would come back, I'd like to give you an opportunity this morning, as I ask a few questions to bring it to a close. Are there altars in your life that are demanding your worship? Are there things in your life that are demanding worship that belongs to God? Is there an altar in your life perhaps that needs reviving? You know, that's exactly what Elijah does. Elijah says, you know what, we were supposed to and meant to worship like this. I'm going to rebuild the altar the way it was supposed to be. And maybe you've come to a point where, you know what, you're saying to yourself, I need to rebuild that altar in my own life. I need to rebuild what I'm supposed to be doing. I need to come back to what I'm supposed to be doing. I've allowed myself to drift. I want to leave you with this one thing this morning. Stop dancing. And if the Lord is God, follow him.